greatest Allied save of World War II didn't happen in a foxhole or behind a tank gun. It happened in a freezing conference room with a promise almost no one believed was possible. December 1944, Hitler's final gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, had just torn through the Ardennes, threatening to split the Allied front in two. The world remembers the siege, the snow, the desperate fighting. But almost no one knows about the decision that actually saved it. Because the real turning point wasn't the battle itself. It was a question Eisenhower asked behind closed doors, and an answer so audacious it left his general speechless. When Eisenhower turned to George Patton and asked, "How soon can you attack?" Patton didn't hesitate. 48 hours, 3 divisions, a complete 90-degree pivot of his entire army. In the dead of winter, it sounded impossible. Except Patton had already prepared for this exact moment weeks earlier, in total secrecy, when everyone else still believed Germany was finished. What followed wasn't just a counterattack. It was one of the most complex military maneuvers in modern warfare, executed at breakneck speed under conditions that would have paralyzed most commanders. If you stay with this story to the end, you'll discover exactly how Patton pulled off what many called a military miracle, and why even Eisenhower, who commanded the entire Allied war effort, later called it the most brilliant operation of the war. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Every view helps bring more stories like this to life. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. By the end of 1944, most Allied commanders believed the war in Western Europe had entered its final, grinding phase. 6 months after breaking out of Normandy, American and British forces had liberated France, pushed through Belgium, and were now massed along Germany's western border. The front lines were stretched thin, exhausted, and battered by weeks of winter weather. But they were stable, and in war, stability is often the most dangerous illusion of all. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, assessed the German Wehrmacht as shattered beyond the ability to launch any large-scale offensive. Intelligence reports reinforced that view. Fuel shortages, collapsing infrastructure, and decimated divisions seemed to guarantee that Germany could do nothing but defend. The expectation across SHAEF headquarters was straightforward: a hard winter of slow advances, followed by a decisive spring offensive into the Ruhr. Victory felt inevitable. It was only a matter of time. But beneath that confidence lay vulnerabilities no one fully recognized. The Ardennes sector, a dense forest of narrow roads and rugged hills, was considered too difficult for major tank operations. It was lightly manned, mostly by Green American divisions rotating in for rest, along with headquarters units and supply depots. The line was quiet. Too quiet. Weather had grounded Allied reconnaissance aircraft for days, leaving commanders blind to enemy movements. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin. To most Allied planners, the Ardennes looked like the safest place on the entire front. To Adolf Hitler, it looked like the perfect place to break it. Unknown to Eisenhower's staff, the German High Command had spent months assembling a massive striking force in near total secrecy. Entire panzer divisions moved under cover of darkness. Radio silence was absolute. Units were disguised as defensive formations. And the very terrain the Allies dismissed as impassable was the same terrain Hitler believed would hide his final gamble. For a few quiet days in mid-December, the Western Front seemed stable, predictable, under control. But one man sensed something was wrong. George S. Patton had been watching the intelligence reports with growing unease. While others saw a beaten enemy, Patton saw warning signs. And in the first week of December, weeks before the crisis hit, he did something almost no one knew about. He ordered his staff to draft 3 contingency plans for a rapid pivot north, in case the Germans tried one last desperate offensive. His staff thought he was being paranoid. After all, everyone knew Germany was finished. Then, at dawn on December 16, 1944, the illusion shattered. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the eastern horizon erupted in fire. Without warning, thousands of German artillery pieces opened up across a 70-mile front. The barrage was staggering, more concentrated firepower than the Americans had faced since Normandy. Shells screamed down on forward positions, command posts, crossroads, and supply depots. Communication lines were severed before anyone could report what was happening. Entire outposts vanished in the first 15 minutes. Radio operators died at their posts, messages half sent. The few fragmented reports that did get through spoke of total chaos. Then came the infantry, and behind them, the armor. More than 200,000 German troops poured out of the Ardennes forest. Terrain the Allies had written off as unsuitable for large-scale operations. Behind them rumbled over 400 tanks and assault guns, including Hitler's last operational armored reserves. Panzer columns pushed down narrow, icy roads, using the thick morning fog as cover. American sentries, half frozen and expecting another quiet morning, stared in disbelief as waves of German soldiers materialized out of the mist. The attack struck the weakest point in the entire Allied line. Many of the American divisions holding the Ardennes were inexperienced. Fresh replacements or units rotating in for rest after brutal fighting elsewhere. Others were spread dangerously thin across sectors that had been quiet for weeks. As German forces smashed into their positions, defensive lines buckled. Companies fell back in disorder. Platoons were overrun before they could organize resistance. Roads filled with retreating vehicles, abandoned equipment, and wounded men stumbling through knee-deep snow. Within hours, the scale of the disaster became undeniable. Communications across the front had completely broken down. Field commanders received contradictory information, some reports describing minor probes, others claiming entire regiments had been wiped out. Weather conditions made aerial reconnaissance impossible. Allied aircraft sat grounded by fog, sleet, and one of the coldest winters Europe had seen in decades. The very conditions that blinded the Allies gave German armor free rein to advance. By midday, a massive bulge, a widening wedge, was tearing open the center of the Allied line, and at the heart of that bulge sat Bastogne, a small Belgian town that controlled 7 critical roads. If Bastogne fell, German spearheads could reach the Meuse River, split the American and British forces in half, and unravel everything the Allies had fought for since D-Day. At SHAEF headquarters, Eisenhower watched the situation spiral beyond anyone's worst predictions. Maps were updated every hour, each time showing the bulge growing larger. Officers struggled to piece together a coherent picture from fragmentary reports. Was this a raid? A spoiling attack? No. This was Hitler's last gamble, and it was working. For 3 days, Eisenhower's headquarters operated in a fog, literal and strategic. Throughout December 16th, 17, and 18, reports flooded into SHAEF from across the collapsing front, units encircled. Regiments gone silent, towns overrun, German armor advancing faster than anyone thought possible. Each new dispatch painted a grimmer picture than the last. Staff officers worked around the clock, trying to sort credible intelligence from panicked rumors. But the sheer volume of bad news made clarity impossible. Eisenhower's senior commanders debated fiercely over what they were actually facing. Was this a local spoiling attack designed to disrupt Allied preparations for a spring offensive? Or was it something far worse, a full-scale strategic gamble aimed at splitting the Allied front in two? Some argued Germany simply didn't have the resources for a major operation. Others pointed to the speed and coordination of the assault as proof this was no improvisation. Meanwhile, the weather turned catastrophic. Dense fog, sleet, and freezing rain kept Allied aircraft grounded across the theater. Without aerial reconnaissance, Eisenhower was blind. German columns could be anywhere, moving, regrouping, exploiting gaps, and there was no way to track them. The fog that paralyzed Allied intelligence became Hitler's greatest ally, and the German timetable was terrifyingly ambitious. Intelligence analysts pieced together fragments of captured orders and intercepted communications. The objective was clear: reach the Meuse River within days, seize the bridges, and drive a wedge between American and British forces. If the Germans succeeded, they could encircle entire armies and force the Allies into a humiliating negotiated peace. The stakes couldn't be higher. By December 18th, one fact dominated every discussion: Bastogne. The small Belgian town sat at the center of a critical road network. 7 highways converged there, making it the key to the entire Ardennes. Lose Bastogne, and German armor would have unrestricted access to the west. Eisenhower made a desperate decision. He ordered the 101st Airborne Division, still recovering from Operation Market Garden, to race to Bastogne and hold it at all costs. They made it, barely. Within hours of their arrival, German panzer divisions encircled the town. The 101st was cut off, outnumbered, and running low on supplies. But they held the roads, for now. Eisenhower stared at the map in his command room. The Bulge was no longer a tactical problem. It was an existential crisis. The entire Western Front teetered on the edge of collapse. He needed options. He needed speed. And most of all, he needed someone bold enough to counterattack into the teeth of a German offensive. He turned to his chief of staff. "Get Patton here. Call a conference at Verdun for the 19th. We need to know what he can do." While Eisenhower's staff scrambled to make sense of the German breakthrough, George Patton had already seen it coming. 3 weeks earlier, in early December, when the front was still quiet, Patton had done something his own staff thought was borderline paranoid. He called in his operations officers and gave them an unusual order: draft 3 contingency plans for a rapid 90-degree pivot north. Plan A: move with 3 divisions. Plan B: 4 divisions. Plan C: 6 divisions. Each plan had to account for disengaging from active combat, rerouting entire corps, and striking into Belgium within 48 to 72 hours. His staff was baffled. Some were openly irritated. Third Army was in the middle of its own offensive, pushing toward the Saar River. Why waste time planning for a phantom threat in the Ardennes? Intelligence said Germany was finished. Every senior commander agreed the Wehrmacht couldn't mount anything more than localized counterattacks. Patton shut down the objections immediately. "The Germans aren't beaten yet," he said, "and when they come, they'll come hard." So his staff went to work, reluctantly at first, then with growing precision. They mapped every road between the Saar and the Ardennes. They calculated fuel requirements for thousands of vehicles moving over icy mountain passes. They coordinated artillery batteries, supply convoys, and medical units. They identified choke points, alternate routes, and bridge capacities. It was exhaustive, tedious work. The kind of logistical planning that takes weeks, not hours. This was the side of Patton almost no one saw. History remembers him as the aggressive tank commander, the profane motivator, the general who believed in speed and audacity above all else. But beneath that reputation lay a meticulous strategist who understood that bold maneuvers required invisible preparation. Patton didn't improvise. He planned obsessively, and then made it look like improvisation. By mid-December, the contingency plans were complete, filed away, and largely forgotten by everyone except Patton. Then came December 16th. The German attack, the chaos, the collapsing front. And suddenly, what had seemed like paranoia looked like prophecy. On the morning of December 19th, Patton climbed into his staff car and began the drive to Verdun. His aides briefed him on the situation during the journey. Bastogne encircled, the Bulge expanding, Eisenhower calling for emergency options. Patton listened quietly, asking a few sharp questions. But he wasn't scrambling for answers. He already had them. The plans were ready, the routes were mapped, the divisions had been alerted. All he needed was Eisenhower's approval, and a single code word to set everything in motion. When the car pulled up to the cold barracks in Verdun, Patton stepped out, straightened his helmet, and walked toward the meeting room. He knew exactly what he was going to say. And he knew no one in that room would believe him. The conference room in Verdun was freezing. A single stove struggled to heat the drafty barracks space as senior Allied commanders filed in, their breath visible in the cold air. The atmosphere was grim, tense, thick with unspoken dread. Maps covered the walls, each one showing the ever-widening bulge tearing through the Ardennes. No one spoke unless necessary. Eisenhower stood at the head of the table, his face lined with exhaustion. He briefed the room with clipped efficiency. Bastogne was encircled. The 101st Airborne was surrounded and running out of supplies. German armor continued pushing west. Weather still grounded air support. The line was bending dangerously, and if it broke, the entire Allied position in Western Europe could collapse. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton. His voice was steady, but the question carried the weight of the entire crisis. "George, I want you to go to Luxembourg and take command of the relief effort." He paused. "How soon can you start the counterattack?" Patton didn't hesitate. The morning of December 21st, with 3 divisions. The room went silent. 48 hours? Eyes widened. A few generals exchanged glances. Someone muttered under his breath. Moving 3 full divisions, disengaging from active combat, rerouting convoys, coordinating artillery and logistics, all in the dead of winter over frozen mountain roads, in 2 days? It defied every principle of military planning. It sounded like the reckless bravado Patton was famous for. Eisenhower leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Don't be fatuous, George." Patton met his gaze calmly. "I'm not." He pulled a folded map from his coat. "I've already written the orders. 3 plans, in fact, depending on how many divisions you want me to move." He spread the map on the table. Routes are mapped, fuel calculated. Division commanders briefed. All I need to do is give the code word, and Third Army starts moving. The room stirred. This wasn't bluster. Patton had actually prepared for this. "When did you draft these plans?" someone asked. "Early December," Patton said simply. "I figured the Germans had one more fight left in them." Eisenhower studied the map, his jaw tight. Every instinct told him this timeline was impossible. But he also knew Patton. The man didn't make promises he couldn't keep, not when it mattered. And right now, the Allies had no other options. Waiting meant losing Bastogne. Losing Bastogne meant losing the Ardennes, and losing the Ardennes could mean losing the war. Eisenhower straightened. "All right, George, you've got your orders. Make it happen." Patton nodded once, rolled up the map, and headed for the door. Before it even closed behind him, he was already calling out to his aide. "Get me headquarters. Tell them it's Plan B. Now." The impossible had just become the mission. Within minutes of leaving Verdun, Patton was on the phone to 3rd Army headquarters. The code word went out. Plan B. Execute immediately. What followed was a logistical miracle disguised as organized chaos. Across a 100-mile front, over 250,000 men began moving at once. Tank battalions disengaged from active firefights with German positions along the Saar River. Artillery batteries ceased fire, limbered up their guns, and hitched them to trucks. Infantry divisions packed their gear, abandoned their hard-won foxholes, and climbed into freezing transport vehicles. Entire corps, divisions that had been fighting eastward for weeks, suddenly pivoted 90 degrees and began rolling north toward Belgium. The roads became rivers of steel and canvas. Thousands of vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, jeeps, supply wagons, all fighting for space on narrow, ice-covered mountain passes. Military police stood at every crossroads, directing traffic non-stop in sub-zero temperatures. Convoys stretched for miles, headlights cutting through snow and sleet. Engines stalled in the cold, tracks slipped on black ice. Vehicles skidded off embankments. But they kept moving. Patton refused to watch from headquarters. He climbed into his jeep and drove the routes himself, appearing wherever the advance stalled. At a frozen bridge near Ardennes, he found a tank column stuck behind a jackknifed supply truck. He jumped out, barking orders, personally directing traffic until the jam cleared. At a staging area near Luxembourg, he walked among exhausted troops loading ammunition in the dark. "We're going to do the impossible again," he told them. "And when it's over, the whole damn world will know what 3rd Army can do." Behind the front lines, combat engineers worked around the clock. They cleared snow from the roads with improvised plows. They repaired bridges damaged by retreating units. They kept supply lines open even as German artillery shells landed nearby. Fuel convoys raced north, refilling tanks at roadside depots. Medics set up aid stations in barns and schoolhouses. The entire machine of war shifted directions with brutal efficiency. German intelligence was stunned. Intercepted radio traffic revealed their disbelief. The Americans couldn't possibly redeploy an entire army this quickly. It had to be a feint, a deception. But it wasn't. Patton's foresight had compressed weeks of planning into hours of execution. By dawn on December 21st, exactly 48 hours after the Verdun meeting, the lead elements of 3rd Army were in position south of Bastogne. Divisions that had been fighting in the Saar were now poised to strike into the flank of the German offensive. Artillery batteries ranged their guns. Tank commanders received their orders. Patton stood on a ridge overlooking the snowbound countryside, binoculars raised. "All right," he said quietly. "Hit them." The counterstrike began. The counterstrike began on December 21st, but progress came at a brutal cost. Patton's divisions drove north into a wall of German resistance and winter fury. The weather turned savage. Temperatures plunged below freezing, winds howled across open fields, and snow fell so thick it reduced visibility to yards. Tank engines froze overnight and had to be thawed with blowtorches each morning. Infantrymen suffered frostbite faster than they took casualties from enemy fire. Vehicles locked in ice, their treads spinning uselessly on frozen roads. Supply trucks skidded into ditches. Medical convoys crawled through whiteouts, struggling to evacuate the wounded. And the Germans weren't retreating. They were fighting for every crossroads, every ridge, every town. The 4th Armored Division spearheaded the advance, smashing into German blocking positions with relentless aggression. At Martelange, a small town straddling a key bridge, Panzer grenadiers dug in and fought house to house. American tanks traded fire with German assault guns at point-blank range. The town didn't fall for a full day. At Bougainville, entrenched German infantry held a strategic hill overlooking the main road to Bastogne. Artillery pounded the position for hours before infantry finally stormed it in hand-to-hand fighting. Every mile was paid for in blood and time was running out. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne clung to survival. Surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off from resupply, they endured constant German bombardment. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies dwindled. Food was rationed to near starvation levels. When the German commander demanded surrender on December 22nd, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent back a single-word reply: "Nuts!" The defiance became legend. But legends don't stop panzers. The 101st needed relief, fast. Patton drove his commanders mercilessly. He visited forward positions daily, appearing in his jeep with pearl-handled pistols gleaming, rallying exhausted soldiers. "Every hour we delay, more men die in Bastogne," he told a stalled tank battalion. "Keep moving. I don't care if you have to push the damn tanks through the snow. Keep moving." By Christmas Eve, 3rd Army had advanced 20 miles. They were close, agonizingly close. Radio contact was established with Bastogne's defenders. Supply drops were attempted, though most fell into German hands. Inside the encircled town, paratroopers listened for the sound of American engines. Any day now, any hour. Christmas morning, 1944. Snow fell softly over the Ardennes. Church bells rang faintly in distant villages. But there was no peace. Patton's forces were still fighting, still clawing forward, still 5 miles short of Bastogne. So close, but not close enough. December 26, 1944. The breakthrough came just after 4 o'clock p.m. The 4th Armored Division's lead battalion, Combat Command Reserve, had been hammering at German positions along the Ardennes-Bastogne road for hours. Artillery pounded enemy strongpoints. Sherman tanks traded fire with dug-in German armor. Infantry advanced through waist-deep snow, clearing hedgerows and farm buildings. The fighting was desperate, vicious, and exhausting. But slowly, yard by yard, the American line pushed forward. Then, suddenly, the German resistance cracked. A gap opened in the encirclement. Lieutenant Charles Bulge, commanding a column of Sherman tanks, didn't hesitate. He gunned his engine and drove straight through, his tanks roaring up the frozen road toward Bastogne. Behind him, more vehicles poured through the breach, half-tracks, jeeps, supply trucks, all racing to reach the besieged town before the Germans could seal the corridor again. Inside Bastogne, paratroopers heard the sound first. Engines, American engines. Not the high-pitched whine of German vehicles, but the deep rumble of Shermans. Men scrambled out of foxholes, staring south in disbelief. Someone shouted, "They're here! They made it!" In a cellar near the town center, a group of combat engineers had been sheltering from artillery fire for days. They were filthy, hollow-eyed, surviving on scraps. Then the door burst open. Sunlight flooded in. An American lieutenant stood in the doorway, snow dusting his helmet, grinning. "You boys need a ride out of here?" For a moment, no one moved. Then the cellar erupted. Men shouted, laughed, some wept openly. One engineer grabbed the lieutenant's hand and wouldn't let go. "You're the first friendly faces we've seen in 8 days," he said, his voice cracking. Within hours, the relief column turned into a flood. Tanks rumbled through Bastogne's shattered streets. Ambulances evacuated the wounded. Supply trucks unloaded ammunition, medical supplies, and hot food. Luxuries the defenders hadn't seen since the siege began. Paratroopers hugged tankers, slapping shoulders, sharing cigarettes. The exhaustion was still there, carved into every face. But so was something else: hope. The Germans knew it immediately. Their timetable, already strained, was now shattered beyond repair. Bastogne was supposed to fall days ago, opening the road to the Meuse. Instead, it held. And now Patton's Third Army had broken the ring. The German offensive, which had driven Allied commanders to the edge of panic just 10 days earlier, began collapsing in on itself. Word spread across the theater like wildfire. Radio operators relayed the news. Commanders called headquarters for confirmation. In freezing foxholes and command posts across Europe, soldiers heard the same impossible fact. Patton had done it. In 48 hours, just like he promised. In the days following the relief of Bastogne, Eisenhower sat in his headquarters reviewing after-action reports. The numbers told a story that still seemed impossible, though. Patton had disengaged over 250,000 men from active combat, pivoted them 90 degrees through a blizzard, and counterattacked in exactly 48 hours, just as he'd promised. The maneuver had shattered German momentum at the critical moment, turning Hitler's last gamble into his final failure. Eisenhower, known for his measured demeanor and reluctance to issue hyperbolic praise, made a private remark to his staff that would later become part of military legend. He called Patton's operation the most brilliant of the war. Coming from the man who had orchestrated D-Day and commanded the entire Allied effort in Europe, it was an extraordinary acknowledgement. Even Eisenhower, who had clashed with Patton repeatedly over discipline and protocol, couldn't deny what had just been accomplished. Across Third Army, Patton's troops celebrated quietly. There were no parades, no grand ceremonies, just exhausted soldiers sharing rations, warming themselves by fires and exchanging stories in hushed voices. They knew what they'd done. They'd executed a maneuver most generals thought impossible, under conditions that would have paralyzed any other army. And they'd done it because one man had seen the crisis coming and prepared for it when no one else believed it was necessary. The failed German offensive had consequences far beyond the Ardennes. Hitler had gambled his last strategic reserves, fuel, armor, elite divisions, on a desperate bid to split the Allies and force a negotiated peace. Instead, he'd lost them all. The Wehrmacht would never recover. The Battle of the Bulge, intended to delay the Allied advance for months, actually hastened Germany's collapse. By spring, Allied forces were crossing the Rhine. By May, the war in Europe was over. But the true turning point hadn't been the siege itself, or even the brutal winter fighting. It had been a decision made in a freezing conference room on December 19th. A question asked by a desperate commander, and an answer that no one believed was possible, except the man who gave it. Patton hadn't relied on luck. He hadn't improvised. He'd planned, prepared, and executed with a precision that defied the chaos around him. And when the moment came, he delivered exactly what he promised. History remembers the Battle of the Bulge for its drama. The snows, the siege, the defiant paratroopers. But the overlooked truth is simpler and more profound. A single question, and one man's impossible answer, held the Western Front together.